In this unit, we're going to look at the urinary system. In terms of anatomy of the urinary system, there are two kidneys, and each kidney has a tube coming off of it called a ureter. And the ureter leads to the bottom part of the bladder. The bladder will store urine until we have an appropriate time and location for urination. There's one tube that leads off of the urinary bladder, and this is called the urethra. In order to expel urine from the bladder, the urine has to travel from the bladder to the urethra and then outside of the body. In terms of functions of the urinary system does some different things, but overall its main goal is to remove waste from the blood and remove any extra stuff from the blood. The urinary system also is used to regulate other things going on in the body, like blood pressure, the amount of water in our body, the amount of electrolytes in our body, and it also helps to regulate pH. And the urinary system secretes some substances. We're going to talk a lot more about renin in another video, but the urinary system, specifically the kidneys, secrete renin. And renin leads to the activation of something called angiotensin II. And we learned about angiotensin II in our cardiovascular unit. Angiotensin II is a very potent vasoconstrictor which increases blood pressure. But as we'll find out, it's also going to have effects on the urinary system itself. The kidneys also secrete erythropoietin, and we learned about this also in our cardiovascular system unit. Erythropoietin is a hormone that tells the bone marrow cells to make more red blood cells. When we make more red blood cells, we increase blood viscosity, which will also increase blood pressure. And the kidneys also secrete the hormone calcitriol, which is also known as vitamin D. Calcitriol production actually begins in the epidermis of the skin, but the final product, which is called calcitriol, does get stored in the kidneys. And calcitriol is released from the kidneys under signaling from another hormone, the parathyroid hormone. We're going to talk more about parathyroid hormone with the urinary system because it does have other effects on the kidneys besides causing the release of calcitriol. Anyways, parathyroid hormone tells the kidneys to release calcitriol, and the calcitriol hormone travels to the small intestines where it tells the small intestines to increase absorption of calcium. That calcium will end up in our blood, and therefore calcitriol helps to increase blood calcium levels. The kidneys are the main organ of the urinary system. They're the ones performing the job that is removing the waste from the blood. And they're able to do this because each kidney contains millions of microscopic organs called nephrons. We'll talk more about nephrons in a little bit. In terms of their location, the kidneys are located in what we call the retroperitoneal position. Retro means behind, and peritoneal is referring to the serous membrane of the abdominal cavity, the peritoneum. So the kidneys aren't actually inside the peritoneal cavity, they are behind it. So they're not part of that peritoneal system like the stomach, for example. The kidneys do have a nervous system supply. It's mostly sympathetic in nature, and it acts as an antidiuretic, and we'll talk more about this in another video. The kidneys do have very good blood circulation going to and from them because, of course, their job is to filter and remove waste from blood. The renal artery is an artery that branches off the aorta and delivers blood to the kidney. And there are several further branches that come off the renal artery within the kidney. But eventually, they all lead to the afferent arterioles. And the afferent arterioles are blood vessels that are bringing blood into a structure called the glomerulus. The glomerulus is a capillary located in the nephron. We'll talk more about this in a little bit. Right now we're just concentrating on the blood supply. Afferent means towards a center. In this case, the center is going to be that glomerulus. So the afferent arteriole brings blood towards the glomerulus, which means the efferent arteriole will bring blood away from the glomerulus. The efferent arteriole will deliver blood into capillaries that surround the outside of the nephron. And then those capillaries will drain into venules, and those venules will drain into several different veins, which eventually drain into the renal vein, which itself will drain into the inferior vena cava. As I mentioned previously, nephrons are the microscopic functional units within the kidneys, and they are the ones that are going to be removing waste from blood. In terms of their location within the kidneys, they are located in both the renal cortex and the renal medulla. The renal cortex is the outer layer of the kidney, and the renal medulla is the inner layer of the kidney. If we were to look at a close-up of the intersection between the renal cortex and the renal medulla, we would see something like the image towards the bottom of the slide. The yellow structure and the sort of dark purplish structure, that's the nephron. And then we have blood vessels too. Notice that a portion of the nephron is located in the renal cortex, but yet another portion of that same nephron is located in the renal medulla. So we say that nephrons are located in both the renal cortex and the renal medulla. Nephrons have two basic parts in them, the renal corpuscle and the renal tubule. The renal corpuscle is the bulbous portion of the nephron that you see in the images. The renal corpuscle, in terms of its structure, is composed of the outer glomerular capsule, and then there's a space called the capsular space, but the majority of the renal corpuscle is taken up by the glomerulus, which is the capillary involved in filtration of blood. In terms of the function, this is where the blood is actually going to be filtered. So we're going to take substances out of the blood and put them into that capsular space. And we now call that fluid in the capsular space filtrate. The filtrate will then flow into the renal tubule. So the renal tubule is what it sounds like. It's this really long, twisty, turny, curvy tube that's connected to the corpuscle. Once the fluid gets into the renal tubule, we call it tubular fluid, but it's the same thing as the filtrate. The renal tubule has different names for the different sections. The section of the renal tubule that's located right attached to the corpuscle, that's called the proximal convoluted tubule. Proximal because it's closest to the corpuscle, convoluted because it's twisty and turny. From there, the tubular fluid will flow into something called the nephron loop. The nephron loop has a descending limb and then an ascending limb. The ascending limb leads to the next part of the renal tubule, which is the distal convoluted tubule. The distal convoluted tubule then flows into the collecting duct. The collecting duct is the last part of the nephron, so this is where we get our final product of urine. And then from the collecting duct, the urine will be put into minor calyces of the kidney. In terms of its function, the renal tubule is sort of fine-tuning the process of urine formation. The main filtration event occurs in the renal corpuscle, but the renal tubule can take additional substances out of that filtrate or tubular fluid, or the renal tubule can add additional substances to that tubular fluid. So it can fine-tune the composition of urine. There are two types of nephrons that we find in our kidneys, cortical nephrons and juxtamedullary nephrons. The cortical nephrons are called cortical because most of the nephron is located in the cortex of the kidney. These are the most common types of nephrons, and this is the one that we'll be using as our example throughout the class. The juxtamedullary nephrons have a renal corpuscle that's located in the cortex, but the remaining portions of the nephron are located in the medulla.